Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and good evening. The amendment before us is a very simple amendment. It simply changes the dates that the policy in the underlying bill will continue through. But those dates mean everything, because the difference between the underlying bill's expiration date, if you will, of July 1st and the date on the amendment of November 3rd is the question as to whether or not this policy will continue over the next several months, and most notably include the November municipal elections across our state. I've got a lot to say on this bill, Madam President, and I'm going to try and put my thoughts in some sort of order that folks that are listening can follow. I think the first thing that I'd like to mention really is that I was very pleased with the opportunity to vote during the special session for the legislation that essentially is similar to this bill and its amendment that brings it through November, except we live in a different world today. No one can argue that the impact of COVID-19 on each of us has been significant. It has affected our lives in almost every conceivable way, not just our individual health and our family members, people in our communities, the businesses that we might own or frequent. There is an indescribable amount of changes that have occurred as a result of COVID-19. And of course, those challenges presented by the virus and, of course, the policies that were enacted on a federal level and also by the state government that impacted the lives of our constituents were significant. And in every case, I think we have all had a sincere desire, regardless of our party affiliation, to assist our constituents in trying to get through this in the best way possible. So back in the special session, when we passed a bill that essentially allowed for what was referred to as COVID-19 voting, I believe it came through this chamber unanimously, and I think there may have been a couple of no votes in the House, but more or less a bipartisan effort to tell our constituents we care and we want to make sure that people have an opportunity to vote, even if they are fearful about COVID-19. But I just want to reiterate that that was a different time. Today is May 5th, 2021, Cinco de Mayo. And if you take a look at the governor's COVID report from today, you'll note that the numbers look vastly different than they did a year ago or when we passed the existing law in the special session. It's a totally different world. Very simple concept. And I've got a number of news articles that I captured just over the last month pointing out that it's a totally different world. Back on April 5th, the CT Mirror reported that the governor's right hand, Josh Cabal, commented, "We're going to be getting some very high numbers of the percentage of the total Connecticut population vaccinated by the end of the month. We think we could be close to 3/4 of the entire population with their first dose by the end of the month." This is what he said in April 5th of 2021. Another article, April 19th, 2021. Trying to figure out what paper this is from. Oh, it's from the CT Post. Governor Lamont said, "As long as we're careful, and on May 19th, we're going to be back to normal." That doesn't sound like we are in the same world of crisis that generated the significant policy change that we made during the special session. April 29th, just a week ago, basically, another article. The state's COVID positive test rate Thursday was down to 1.34%, the lowest rate since early October, and hospitalizations are barely over 400, the lowest number since early March. And some comments from Governor Lamont. "You know, I'm not a day trader, but this is a 4-week trend. Over the last couple of weeks, the positivity rate is down 50%. So I like to think that this is a trend that is going to be with us for a long time. And I'll share just one more article from 2 days ago, also in the CT Mirror. This is in response to Governor Lamont's press conference, where he announced that Connecticut is the very first state to achieve a vaccination rate of over 50%. He says that's an extraordinary achievement that allows the reopening to continue in a prudent way. It makes such a big difference, said Lamont, who is eliminating all limits on businesses other than wearing masks indoors as of May 19th. Josh Cabal is also quoted in the same article saying, last year's experience suggests that the summer should be a period, in Connecticut at least, of extremely low transmission, even at the vaccination rates we currently have. So these are the highest ranking officials in our state government, and they seem poised to reopen our state based on the data that they have with regard to the virus. If there's no other reason, Madam President, and there are definitely other reasons to vote no on this legislation, that's the first reason, which is it's really unnecessary. And I would argue that if we do end up in a position that is similar to what created the very first bill like this and the governor's emergency powers and executive orders, it can easily be recreated. The same folks are in the same offices. The governor will have the ability to declare another emergency. The process by which he would have his powers approved and to be able to issue another executive order is the same. And there is no doubt, I don't think anyone in this chamber would suggest that the result would be different either. We are all concerned about keeping our constituents safe. We are all concerned about making sure that they have their right to vote protected. And I don't believe any one of us would do anything to stand in the way of them exercising that right. But there are other problems, Madam President, with this legislation. It's a somewhat complicated issue involving what our Constitution says and what was really intended by the bill that was passed during the special session. One thing that matters very much to me as a state senator and someone who has served in this legislature for 11 years is the rule of law. The rule of law means something to me. It means something to me when we draft legislation, amendments, and we take votes. People that serve with me probably in some ways think I'm a real pain in the rear end because I insist on reading things. I insist, Madam President, on knowing what I'm voting for. And I'm not suggesting that other members don't, but there are different levels and degrees of knowing what you're voting for. And I am on this end of the spectrum that says, I must know it all. Consequently, things sometimes stand out to me that they might not stand out to other folks. What has happened and transpired with our election laws over the last year and a half since COVID-19 began affecting our state, our citizens, our constituents, and what we do as a state government has created a lot of questions and a lot of doubt, and sadly, a lot of very questionable policy. And one of those questionable policies is what we have for election law in the state currently with regard to voting by absentee ballot as a result of COVID-19. I started my comments by saying I was proud to vote for the bill in special session because I believe it was necessary at the time. But I would also point out that I was operating under a set of, let's say, understanding of what that bill intended and what voting for it meant that I don't know everyone shared. And that's a result of having pretty intimate understanding, and that comes from lots of review of the language in our Constitution that with regard to our voting laws. So to me, I took the whole situation very seriously, and I'm going to speak for a bit just about what transpired and what I see as the problems with that. But before I do, I just want to approach this bill from another angle, which is, why is this really before us, Madam President? And I believe it has nothing to do with COVID-19. I think, as I just pointed out, that COVID-19 is on the wane in Connecticut, and there's little chance that it's going to become such a problem that we need to address it in our voting laws before this coming November. And as I said, the mechanism exists to do so if that happens. So I guess I would start by asking that question of the proponent of the bill, which is, what is the need for this existing law, which brings us through? That's a good question. I don't know what the date the current legislation expires. So let me ask that question first. Madam President, through you, what is the date that the current COVID-19 voting law we passed in the special session expires?
Senator Flexer.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, the legislation that we passed last year expired last year.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate that answer. And that's very interesting, because after all of this conversation, I hadn't pondered on whether or not it had affected the recent, although relatively few, municipal elections. Is the intention of this legislation, through you, Madam President, to allow the current and upcoming maybe potential budget referendums or few scattered elections that might occur through June 30th, the intent of the underlying bill? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Madam President, yes, so the legislation that we passed last year has expired. It expired in 2020. So this year, as we've seen a number of different communities have special elections for the Senate or the House, they've had special elections for the office of First Selectman and other municipal offices, and there have been referendums on school construction and renovations. There have been budget referendums. There were a number of communities that had a May municipal election just this Monday. All of those elections did not get to take place under the statutes that were passed last year. Those voters and those elections officials were able to move forward with absentee ballots under the COVID-19 protections, similar to the legislation that we passed last year, but that was through executive orders. So for all of 2021, as various communities were faced with smaller votes in their towns, they didn't know what the rules were, and they were constantly looking to see whether the governor's executive orders were going to be updated or expanded or extended in order to cover their election period. And as we get closer and closer to those orders expiring in another few weeks, there's a lot of communities that have budget referendums that will find themselves in the same place as every community that's had an election thus far this year.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you very much for that answer. Does this mean that there is no current executive order also that is allowing an expansion of absentee voting for COVID-19 currently in force, through you, Madam President?
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Madam President, there is an executive order in place right now. We covered the special elections on Monday, but I believe those orders expire 2 weeks from today.
Senator Sampson.
All right, thank you very much, Madam President, and I appreciate the kind chairman for her answer. So that makes a lot of sense, and that also explains why I didn't put a lot of emphasis on it, because it occurred to me that I was relying on the fact that this is still lawful, because it's going to continue as long as the governor's executive orders do, which is going to be May 9th, as I understand. I guess where I want to go from here is really just to expand on the idea that I think it's clear that there is no logical reason why we would want to continue this policy beyond May 19th unless there was a significant reason to believe that COVID-19 was going to be as prominent as it has been in the past. I want to also point out what our current state constitution requires for absentee balloting. And I think that's a good place to start to let people understand exactly what happened with this law and whether or not it's good public policy. The Connecticut state constitution allows for absentee balloting under certain circumstances. And they are enumerated in our state constitution under, I believe it's Article 6, Section 7. And it reads that the General Assembly may provide by law for voting in the choice of any officer to be elected or upon any question to be voted on at an election by qualified voters of the state who are unable to appear at the polling place on the day of election because of absence from the city or town of which they are inhabitants, or because of sickness, or physical disability, or because the tenets of their religion forbid secular activity. So it's clear to me from reading that sickness is already included as a reason. So anyone that was affected by COVID-19 was certainly already taken care of. In an effort last year for the pandemic to have less impact on voters, lots of policy discussions obviously ensued, and we ended up with an executive order that continues to this day. That executive order was 7QQ, which I want to share with the folks also. It lays out essentially how significant COVID-19 and its impact was on the state, and ultimately declares, now therefore I, Ned Lamont, Governor of the state of Connecticut, by the authority vested in me, so on, expands voting eligibility during the COVID-19 pandemic to say that the statute is modified for the August primary election if that person, if he or she is unable to appear at his or her polling place during the hours of voting because of the sickness of COVID-19. It goes on to say that for the purposes of this modification, a person shall be permitted to lawfully state he or she is unable to appear at a polling place because of COVID-19 if at the time he or she applies for or casts an absentee ballot, there is no federally approved and widely available vaccine for prevention of COVID-19. I think that's worth noting, that the governor's executive order made it clear that he felt this expansion was necessary because there was not a readily available vaccine at the time. So I would add that to a list of reasons why I think the law that we passed last year varies very differently from what we are doing today. Last year, we were in the midst of the pandemic. There were a myriad of cases, and there was great fear in the populace about COVID-19. Connecticut on Cinco de Mayo 2021 is a different world. And I would point out that this bill is important, and the amendment that is before us is important because it doesn't just refer to May 5th, 2021, but more importantly refers to Election Day in November of 21, where we have no real idea what is going to be the case. So what is really going on here? What is the reason for this extension? Why is this before us if there's already a mechanism to take care of this situation by the same exact means that we took care of it before if the virus has a resurgence? And I believe, sadly, that what's happening is the majority party is going to use the pandemic as an opportunity to alter our election process for their own benefit. Democrats historically have lower turnout figures during elections. That's just a factual statement. And consequently, I think that they would like to see an increase in those turnout figures that might help them electorally, just like anyone else would try and do anything else to gain advantage in an election. And I will say that I don't disagree with that in one way. I want to see more people voting also. I want to see more people voting and have access to voting, even if it means they are voting for my opponent. But I want to say, most importantly, that if we are going to expand voting, okay, no problem, I agree. I want to see people voting also, but it must be done in the proper way and with an eye towards maintaining the legitimacy and credibility of our elections. It is a very sad state, Madam President, when you can read a poll that shows that more than half of our country's citizens do not have faith in our election process. For me, election policy is about one thing, and that is making sure that we have free and fair elections that are worthy of the free citizens that I represent. And I will tell you, Madam President, that this last year has been positively impossible for Republicans on the subject of elections. Despite years and years, honestly, of prominent national and some Connecticut Democrats making baseless and what I would say completely factless and untrue accusations of voter interference in the case of Russian collusion. We even got to hear our own Secretary of State speak about how the Russians are trying to influence our elections over and over when she came before the GAE committee in 2020. She even hired someone that is called a disinformation expert, all the time suggesting that Russians or whomever can tamper with the vote counting. Newsflash for anyone listening, this was never true. There's never been any evidence of someone, Russians or otherwise, tampering with our vote counting. Certainly, there is influence on elections that comes from a lot of different places, but nothing that actually matched what the people were led to believe by politicians on their TV screens telling them that Russians were interfering with our elections. And of course, now we have a Democrat president, and the new narrative is that all elections are perfect. And in fact, no one can make a suggestion that's something that should be checked or improved upon. And God forbid they utter the term voter fraud. Otherwise, the entire machine goes to work mocking that foolish person for caring about having clean elections as some kind of nut that is buying into the quote-unquote big lie that they hang around the neck of the former president. I know this all too well because I have been the recipient of this treatment repeatedly and from every angle, not just from people in my district who have bought into every talking point that describes folks that are concerned about elections as evil Trumpers or, something worse. Full disclosure, I'm a Republican. And yes, I voted for Trump. However, I have a brain. And I use it to judge things objectively and based on the evidence. This means that I will question a Trump supporter when they come to me and tell me that the presidential election was stolen. And I will do that to the same degree that any Democrat might challenge them. But, Madam President, it also means that my radar goes off when I see bills like this. I have a few questions I would like to ask the proponent, Madam President, if I could.
Prepare yourself, Senator Flexer. Please proceed, sir.
So, Section 1 of the bill, and forgive me, Madam President, I don't want to run into a complication of speaking on the bill rather than the amendment. So I hope that everyone understands completely that the amendment, while it's very short in nature, essentially is modifying the bill only by extending the dates through November. But to me, that is the crux of the bill, that these policies extended through November are the issue. And I think I'm within my rights to have this conversation on the amendment simply because I'm arguing against the extension through November based on the underlying bill and what will be changed as a result.
It is a good reminder, sir, that we are indeed discussing the amendment. So please proceed with your questions.
Yes. Thank you very much, Madam President. At any rate, the bill uses the term the sickness of COVID-19. So through you, Madam President, I wonder what that is defined as.
Senator Flexer.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, under the underlying bill, lines 20 through 23 define what COVID-19 means. I'd be happy to read that if that is appropriate, Madam President.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. Yes, I understand that those lines do describe that COVID-19 is a respiratory disease and so on. But we don't often say that someone can vote by absentee because of the existence of something. Does this sickness of COVID-19 imply that the individual voter has the sickness of COVID-19 or something else? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Madam President, it could include a voter who has the sickness of COVID-19.
Senator Sampson.
Through you, Madam President, I understand that would indeed be covered because that is that individual person's illness. But would it cover someone that is not individually sick by COVID-19 in some other way? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Madam President, yes, it would.
Senator Sampson.
So let me just be more specific about absentee balloting with regard to the questions I just asked. So if the Senate does not approve this legislation, would an individual with a positive diagnosis of COVID-19 be able to apply for and vote by absentee ballot? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Madam President, I believe under our current law, any sickness would qualify someone to receive an absentee ballot.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. And if the Senate rejects this legislation, would an individual that does not have a positive diagnosis of COVID-19 or a potential exposure to COVID-19 be able to apply for and vote for by absentee ballot? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Madam President, I want to be very careful in my answer. So could the senator just repeat the beginning of his question?
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm asking that if the Senate rejects this legislation, so we're operating under the current law, would an individual who is not positively diagnosed with COVID-19 and has not been potentially exposed to COVID-19 be able to apply for and vote by absentee ballot?
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Madam President, I believe they would.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I am interested in the gentle lady's answer. I'm hoping that she can tell me, based on what language in the current law, that would be allowed. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Flexer.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, it's through the language, the term illness in current law and sickness in our state constitution as interpreted by Connecticut's Supreme Court last year.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. No, and I appreciate that answer, and I actually had documented in my notes that I was curious about what answer I would receive, because I believe that there are two valid answers to a question. And when there are two valid answers to a question, Madam President, that should tell you that there's a problem with the laws that you have before you. And I don't disagree with the chairman. She is correct that if we accept the interpretation of the Constitution as a result of the Supreme Court decision last year, they did stipulate that the word sickness applies to more than just an individual. However, our current statute is quite clear that it says a person's illness. It does not refer to a group at all. And it makes one wonder which is taking precedent, the actual statute that we have in our laws, an interpretation by a court after a legal challenge, or the words of the Constitution itself. As I pointed out earlier when I read the state constitution to the folks listening, I think it's quite clear that the people that drafted it were referring to an individual, because everything about the sentence implies that it is about a voter's inability to appear. It is not about whether or not there is a sickness in the world, and otherwise they would have said so. The terms because of absence from the city or town, you wouldn't go vote absentee because someone else is absent from your city or town, or because of physical disability. You certainly would not vote by absentee because your neighbor is disabled. And you certainly would not vote by absentee because of the tenets of your neighbor's religion. So it's safe to say that all of those items refer to an individual. And when they say individual, it is because of that individual's sickness. And that is, up until recently, not in any dispute. The state statute, I believe, was written with the term his or her illness purposely to conform to that language. What I'm getting at, Madam President, is simply that there is great confusion about what has occurred as a result of this law. I want to point out also that in the Supreme Court decision, the decision has a sentence in it which is essentially their conclusion. Although the plaintiffs have identified concerns, so and so and so on, they say that the executive order, 7QQ, which, remember, is an executive order that relies on no vaccinations being readily available, nevertheless represents a considered judgment by our political branches that the limited expansion of absentee voting is an appropriate measure to protect public health. So I have another question through you, Madam President, and that is, if we are relying on the Supreme Court's decision that someone would be able to vote even without this law, which is what I believe the gentle lady said, because the term illness is good enough to include someone that doesn't have the illness themselves, I'd like to know if she understands what they meant by limited expansion. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Madam President, I can't say any clearer what the Supreme Court, our Supreme Court, meant by limited expansion any more than they did in the language in their decision.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. So I know this is a difficult concept for folks that are not really familiar with this statute or have really contemplated what our constitutional requirements are for absentee voting. But let me just tell you that anyone that is having a conundrum right now, because we just heard that the Supreme Court says that you don't need this law before us to be able to apply for an absentee ballot, simply because there is sickness in the world. I had asked whether or not this law, even if it was not passed to include the sickness of COVID-19, someone would be able to get an absentee ballot. And the chairman, I believe correctly, answered yes. And if that's true, then we don't need this bill, Madam President, because it doesn't do anything. However, I do find it interesting that the Supreme Court would suggest that somehow they were only authorizing a limited expansion. I don't know what they meant by that, because if someone is able to obtain an absentee ballot because there is an illness that doesn't affect them personally, That would require that no one in the world is sick for someone not to be eligible for an absentee ballot. I don't know if that's good policy or not, Madam President, but I will tell you it's not a good way to write a law. Is there anyone, through you, Madam President, that the gentle lady doesn't believe is covered by the subject of illness based on our previous conversation? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Madam President, I don't know that I could speak for every single voter and whether or not they would choose to find themselves qualifying under illness. I would just say that I think we've seen over the last several months in the conversation we've had here this evening with regard to the period of time since last year's statutory changes have expired, there has been a lot of confusion. And so sometimes state statute holds great value in clearing up confusion both for any member of the public, any resident of our state, but particularly on this, it's an effort to clear up confusion as we've had over the last several months. While the Supreme Court may have made their determinations and made it clear that there is a broader access to absentee ballots under our current statutes and under the provisions of our Constitution, it's been very clear as we've contemplated this legislation and watched the various municipal election officials and municipal candidates navigate the uncertain territory they were in with regard to the use of absentee ballots, that there is some clarity needed, and I would argue that that's what the bill before us provides. Some clarity beyond the great interpretation a person might do of that Supreme Court decision from last year.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I took a lot of time before this debate to draft a lot of notes, but this is one of those debates where you don't know how it's going to go because the answers to questions or just the conversation might lead you on a different path. So I want to continue on the subject rather than relying on my notes. The gentle lady said that the statute that is before us may help because it would provide clarity for our constituents to understand what the requirements are for eligibility. I'm curious to know exactly what that means, but I will ask a very direct question, which is that if this bill passes, I believe it reads that as long as COVID-19 is a respiratory disease, because the only requirement is not that someone has this disease, but rather that there is a sickness of COVID-19, and it is prior to November 3rd, if the amendment passes, then a person will be eligible for an absentee ballot. I believe that's correct. I have asked that question a different way before, but I will ask that question once again through you, Madam President. Is that correct, that as long as COVID-19 is a sickness and exists prior to November 3rd, that would create a situation where someone is eligible for an absentee ballot? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Madam President, that is correct.
Senator Sampson.
So thank you very, very much. So if COVID-19 ceased to exist, I wonder if that would continue. But certainly November 3rd is going to come and go. After November 3rd or after July 1st, if the amendment does not pass, does that mean that a person, through you, Madam President, would not be eligible for an absentee ballot if COVID-19 exists, but they are not subjected to the illness? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Madam President, can the good senator repeat just the last sentence of his question again? I just want to make sure I answer it precisely.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm asking if the person who is requesting an absentee ballot application, if they have had no exposure to COVID-19 and they are not sick with COVID-19, whether they would be eligible for an absentee ballot once this law expires. So November 4th if the amendment passes, or July 2nd if it does not. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Madam President, I apologize, Madam President. So the senator is asking whether a person can apply for an absentee ballot after the sunset dates of either the underlying bill or the amendment?
Senator Sampson.
Yes, through you, Madam President, I'm asking if someone can apply for an absentee ballot even without exposure to COVID-19 after the expiration of this policy, or depending on whether the amendment passes, whichever date. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Madam President, the amendment before us only deals with the period of time between now and November 3rd. I actually believe the sunset date is November 3rd, so it would be inclusive of the November municipal election, but not beyond that. So the legislation that's before us would not be expanding that absentee ballot access to November 4th, or without the amendment, July 1st on the underlying bill.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. Yeah, and I apologize that these questions become somewhat confusing. That is not my intent at all. I am trying to be as clear as I possibly can. But I'll just explain the way I'm reading this, which is that we have a Supreme Court decision, which I believe personally to be an error because it is in direct conflict with our state constitution. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that I am very much in favor of allowing people access to voting as a result of COVID-19. But I would have argued during the special session, and I will argue today, that in order to do that, you need a constitutional amendment. I would be glad to vote for such a constitutional amendment if it was before me, but it is not. What we have before me is a bill which I believe proposes to create no excuse absentee voting without a constitutional amendment. And it relies on a Supreme Court decision, which I believe cannot be sustained in a conversation because it doesn't make any sense. And if it is an accurate and legitimate Supreme Court decision that should rewrite our Constitution and that we should rely on as policy, then the law, the bill before us, offers nothing. Because the argument made by the Supreme Court is that as long as there is illness in the world, as I said, you are eligible for an absentee ballot. And therefore, we wouldn't need legislation that defines COVID-19 or limits the time that you would be eligible as a result of its existence. Because it would forevermore state that as long as there is illness, you can get an absentee ballot. I point out that this body is contemplating an actual constitutional amendment to create no excuse absentee voting. And I've been supportive of such a policy as long as we put appropriate protections in place. But I would point to that as an acknowledgement that we do not have no excuse absentee voting, and an acknowledgement that the Supreme Court decision cannot be correct. And I feel honestly terrible for the chairman of the committee for the questions that I'm asking her because they're virtually impossible to answer. Because you have to do one of two things. You have to either accept that the court was correct to say that we have no excuse absentee voting without a constitutional amendment, in which case we shouldn't even be debating this law. Or you've got to say that that is not correct, in which case somehow, some way, this law has to limit voting in a way that does not create a situation where no excuse is required. And I don't think that is achievable, Madam President. I think that we have found ourselves in a place where we have so many conflicting documents and conflicting actions by our state government and our courts. All three branches of government have weighed in on this issue, actually. You have executive orders, you have legislation passed by this body, and you have the courts. And we've all weighed in on the subject of COVID-19 voting, and we've done it in different ways, and now I believe we have a conflict that is virtually impossible to overcome. And I believe that this happened intentionally because of politics, Madam President. And that's the part of this that I really don't want to get into, but I think is so necessary. You know, back when COVID-19 first occurred in the state, the Secretary of State obviously felt the pressure to do something in reaction. So she issued a memorandum of opinion. And she essentially lays out a reason why we should allow more people access to absentee balloting based on the sickness requirement in the Constitution and our state laws. And she issued a memorandum of opinion back on January 11th, 2021. And she stood by this opinion that says that given the reasoning she sets forth, which is essentially an argument about what sickness means, she believes any registered voter who has an underlying medical condition may vote by absentee ballot if they believe their illness would prevent them from appearing at the designed, I think she meant designated, polling place because of the COVID-19 virus. Now, I don't know if that was constitutional or not. In fact, I think at the time there was great question over whether or not even that was constitutional, but yet that was her interpretation, that his or her illness would now extend to anyone who has an underlying medical condition that might put them in a predicament. So that's one version of what was intended by the current law and who should be eligible for an absentee ballot. The governor then issued his executive order, which I've already covered, which is clearly relying on the Secretary of State's memorandum, which I just read to you. The only thing he did was make it clear that it applied only to the primary, and then it also required that no federally approved and widely available vaccine for prevention was available. So another interpretation of what would constitute a reason to expand sickness as far as no excuse absentee voting. But that didn't end there, because the Secretary of State then produced another memorandum of opinion. And she said this time that it included any registered voter who has a pre-existing illness can vote by absentee ballot, because that voter's illness would prevent them. In addition, individuals who may have been in contact with a COVID-19 infected individual, such as healthcare workers, first responders, individuals caring for someone with increased risk, as well as those who feel ill, or think they ill, or possibly had contact with someone with COVID-19, which is a very broad description, but yet a third entirely different interpretation of what the word illness and sickness might mean and how it applies to voters. I'll remind everyone listening about how important I said it was that we have a rule of law that makes sense, that people can actually look at and understand. And when you come out with 3 different things in the period of a couple of months, there's no wonder there's confusion. I believe the good chairman said right off the bat that the point of this was clarity, because there has been confusion. I believe we are only adding to the confusion, Madam President. And I will admit that during the special session, when we voted on the legislation that essentially we are recreating here, I was confused, because I was relying on the last memorandum from the Secretary of State, because to me that was the last guidance that I had received about what we were voting on when we voted to expand our absentee ballot eligibility to include sickness. So one of 2 things happened, and I'm completely off my notes, but that's fine, Madam President, because I think what we're talking about is much more important than what I had contemplated to discuss with you before. One of 2 things happened. Either one, we created no excuse absentee voting without having a constitutional amendment when we passed that law, and we should not have done that. Or we passed a law that was limited in the way described by the Secretary of State's memorandum of opinion. The thing is, if we passed an unconstitutional law expanding us to having no excuse absentee voting without having a constitutional amendment, then shame on us. And the court should have struck down that law when it was the result of challenges. Or alternatively, we did not pass an unconstitutional law because it still fell within the confines created by the Secretary of State's memorandum, broad though it may be. But the Secretary of State herself, when she sent out absentee ballot applications to every person on the voter rolls, which is the main topic of my conversation tonight, she did so in grave error because she put a sentence on there that said that any person could check the box because of the sickness of COVID-19. That was not her interpretation in her own memorandum. She didn't say any person. She described the persons who were actually eligible. But she led the public to believe that any person could check the box. So believe me when I say this is a real conundrum. The question is, do we have no excuse absentee voting in Connecticut? Did we have it in the most recent election? Was the election that took place in November of 2020 legitimate because people voted by absentee thinking it was a no excuse absentee vote election when it was not, because that would be unconstitutional, or because we didn't make it that way, but the Secretary of State's actions implied that it was? Those are pretty important questions. I want to just talk about, in the underlying bill, on line 24, and this, of course, applies whether it is extended through November or not. There's a statement here that says, and this is existing law, but it is part of this policy. It says, no person shall misrepresent the eligibility requirements for voting by absentee ballot prescribed in subsection A of this section, which is essentially our law that lays out the reasons for absentee balloting. So the question is, did the Secretary of State do that with her mailing? Did she mislead or misrepresent eligibility requirements when she said all people can check the box? I believe she did. Through you, Madam President, is it the proponent of the bill, and I hate to put her in this spot, is it her opinion that all voters were really allowed to vote in the previous election by absentee, and would all voters again be allowed to vote by absentee if this bill becomes law? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Madam President, the statutes that we passed last year would allow any voter for COVID-19 to be the reason they applied for an absentee ballot and use that to vote. And this bill before us would do the same thing. Any voter could have COVID-19 be the reason why they requested an absentee ballot and use the absentee ballot to vote.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. So if we say all voters can use that, are there any voters who cannot use that excuse? Through you, Madam President.
Senator Flexer.
Through you, Madam President, I don't believe that there are, but no voter would have to. It would be up to the individual voter's interpretation as to whether or not they wanted to use that as a reason for requesting an absentee ballot.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. Yeah, so that's pretty clear to me. That is no excuse absentee voting. That's exactly what it is. No one has a requirement to do it, but anyone can. And they don't need an excuse. The mere existence of an illness anywhere in the world counts if you believe the Supreme Court, and no excuse, and COVID-19 being a sickness counts if you go by the statute. In Section 2, I think it's very interesting. This lays out the language that appears on every absentee ballot, and I believe this language appears in both Section 2 and Section 3. No, maybe it's just Section 2 in two places, because I think it appears both on the inner and outer envelope of an absentee ballot. And I will point out that it says, and we are asking our constituents when they vote by absentee ballot to sign this document, it says, I hereby state under penalties of false statement that I am eligible to vote at this election, and they list the reasons, and the reasons have not been changed. They remain what the statute has always said, which relies on the constitutional requirement. It says, my illness or physical disability. So we're asking people to sign something that says that, simultaneously with telling them that all voters can fill out the box. Just following up on how I don't know how to approach this really in a way that makes a lot of sense from a legislative standpoint, because we did not create this statute until after it occurred the first time, but did we enable it to occur the second time, in the sense that Section 3 states that the Secretary of State may make any changes in any forms which, in the opinion of the Secretary, are necessary to conform to the applicable provisions of the federal law. And, of course, the chapter before, which is the one that lays out what the reasons are for absentee voting. So it makes me wonder why this exists in this language. Did we do this because we knew that she had made those changes for the primary election and wanted her to have the same authority unchallenged going forward? I don't know. But I will tell you that it concerns me either way to give the Secretary of State such broad powers. And I had actually offered a bill this year that would have said that the Secretary of State must come before the Regulations Review Committee with any changes that she has made under this language, because I believe it's the responsibility of this legislature to have oversight when an elected partisan individual is in a position to affect our election policy in such a huge way, based on her own opinion. Moving on, Section 4. Section 4 is the section that allows absentee ballots to be mailed to an applicant by a municipal clerk or by a third party. If you heard me during the special session, you heard me go on ad nauseum about the problems that were faced when this happened. There is a line on line 89 of the underlying bill that says, shall be mailed to a bona fide personal mailing address. I find that ironic because 100,000, more than 100,000, absentee ballot applications were returned in the primary election in 2020 alone. And since then, not a single thing, as far as I know, has been done by the Secretary of State to rectify that situation. Now, I understand that those absentee voter, or the voter rolls, are the subject of the local town governments to maintain, but I don't know what guidance they have been given, and I'm unable to seem to find out exactly how many absentee ballot applications were returned during the general election in November. But judging by that number, I would say it's in excess of 200,000, maybe 250,000 were returned. I have some concerns about the entire process. First off, what approval process do we have when we are determining what creates a vendor who is eligible? What is the selection process? Does the Secretary of State just pick whoever she wants? Is there an approval and selection process? Is there a bid? Is this a contract that has to be approved by DAS? I don't know any of those things, and none of that seems to appear in this section. And I suspect that that is not the case. I believe we are giving the Secretary of State that power once again. Section 5 allows those absentee ballots to be deposited in a secure drop box. I spoke at length on this subject also at the last time we had this conversation about election laws. And I raised significant concerns about the drop boxes, which I maintain. And this bill before us will continue the use of those, what are referred to as secure drop boxes. And I think that is somewhat on a play of words, because I don't believe they are particularly secure. What was wrong with mailboxes is what I have as a question. You could always return your absentee ballot in a mailbox. What are we doing adding more mailboxes in town that look differently, thinking that we are achieving something? Those absentee ballot drop boxes also are not monitored. As far as I know, some of them are placed outside of town halls where they might be in a good spot to prevent tampering or vandalism, but other ones were placed in places with no cameras and no protection whatsoever. And I don't know how often they were opened. I don't know how often they were collected. I've received some correspondence even today from the town clerks and registrars indicating that they are confident that the chain of custody has been maintained in the use of those, which makes me feel a little bit better. But I don't know that they were ever necessary or a good use of taxpayer money. And I don't believe that those boxes are particularly secure. I had, during a Government Administration and Elections Committee, shared a photograph that was sent to me of one of those drop boxes with a bunch of ballots hanging out of it. And in an effort to discredit my supposed claim, someone took that picture and sent it off to the State Elections Enforcement Commission. And I think for the purpose of saying, well, we have to show Senator Sampson that no funny business is happening. And they seemed rather pleased to be able to point out that that photo was taken after the primary election day. To which I say, how can we be happy with that? I think that those folks believed that their votes were going to be counted because, as was discussed, there is a lot of confusion. What I don't want, Madam President, is confusion about how we do our elections. As I said, Madam President, I had originally intended on going through the bill, and I have some comments and notes on many, many sections. But I'm going to skip ahead, although I'm going to mention of a couple of different things that are also in this bill. And then I will wrap up by essentially discussing the larger point and concern that we began with. But in Section 14 of the bill, I discovered something that I have some concern about, and that is that there is a deadline that exists for someone to withdraw their absentee ballot vote that has existed for many, many years in our laws. And that essentially allowed someone, if they had voted by absentee, to go and withdraw their vote all the way up until 10 a.m. on Election Day. And now that is being changed to the fourth day before election at 5 p.m. And I am curious as to why such a change would be made in this bill. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Flexer.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, the legislation that is before us mirrors the legislation that was passed last year and became statute. It has both provisions from the July special session and I believe our October 1st special session. And so the section that the good senator is asking about is just a replication of the legislation that we passed in the October special session to allow there to be more time for the processing of absentee ballots, similar to the extra time that we gave town clerks and registrars last year. And so when you do that, you would limit the ability of a voter to come in and change their absentee ballot from the timeline that is in current law in an effort to give the elections officials more time to begin the very basic parts of processing the ballots, not actually counting ballots, but just organizing them in a way so that they're prepared to be counted on the day of the actual election, primary, or referendum.
And Senator, the hour is late, so we are just going to make sure that we are still discussing the amendment.
Thank you, Madam President. And certainly, we are discussing the impact of the amendment on the underlying bill and how it will affect the November election. And the November election will be subject to this provision if the amendment passes. I believe this, based on the previous conversation, that the law passed during the special session has since sunset. I believe we have probably reverted back to the 10 a.m., or rather the 10 a.m. on election day. So this change is going to be again instituted if this bill passes. And I believe it's unfortunate. I had even drafted an amendment to fix this and put it back because I do believe that people that vote by absentee ballot should still maintain that ability to be able to change their vote all the way up to election day. Sections 15 through 20 of the bill are a lot of other deadlines and extensions that are made. We could go on ad nauseum about understanding why all of these changes are being made, which for what I think is a relatively small change in our policy, understanding the Supreme Court's decision and how sweeping that is. I want to take a second just to mention the fiscal note, which the only fiscal note that is available to me, Madam President, is the fiscal note that reflects the original effective date. There is no modified fiscal note, to my knowledge, based on the amendment through November. But this fiscal note shows $105,000, and I believe that $105,000 is reflective. Voila, I've got 100 pages in front of me, and I had to find the right one, but I did. It shows the impact of about $100,000, $105,000. And I presume that is with regard to just a few municipal elections and the cost of doing a mailing of absentee ballot applications. I can only imagine what the cost might be if that was implemented statewide. So here we are. We're faced with this bill, which is going to resurrect the policy that we enacted during a crisis and was done in a way that I think was unclear. And sadly, we have not addressed that lack of clarity in this new language, nor have we addressed a lot of other things. Since November's municipal election, which was filled with significant confusion with regard to people receiving absentee ballot applications for people that had moved out of their home. They received them for children that had now resided in another state, people that had passed on. Folks received them in their maiden name and their married name. During the special session, I think I enumerated several dozen individual examples that I received from constituents showing me absentee ballot applications that they received in error. And again, I will repeat that no policy changes have been made to update those voter rolls since then. There have been no policy changes to make our absentee voting more secure. We still do not have a signature verification process in this state. We still do not have photo identification for in-person or absentee voting. We do not have auditing of Election Day registration. We do not have auditing of absentee ballots. We do not have auditing of provisional ballots. These are all very, very serious questions. I believe this bill, even being here, is attempting to essentially extend this no excuse absentee voting process with no protections and without the required constitutional amendment, and it will cover another major election in our state, and there's no reason for it to be here. As far as I know, there is not one documented case of someone getting sick from COVID by voting in person in Connecticut or anywhere else that I know of. I did do a Google search and I found some article about 52 people who tested positive in Wisconsin. That's it for the whole country, where almost every state adopted some sort of mail-in voting as a response to COVID-19. But still many people voted in person. And yet, I don't believe there's a documented case of someone succumbing as a result. As I started from the outset, I'm sad because I believe this bill that's before us is not so much about protecting people with COVID-19 like it was during the special session. I don't think that's what it's about at all. We have a mechanism to solve that problem. I offered to let this bill fly through this chamber without any challenge from me whatsoever if we just left it at July 1st so that it would cover the municipal elections that were mentioned earlier that there is some concern about. I also agreed to let this bill go here without a challenge from me if there was a prohibition on the mass mailing of absentee ballot applications. But sadly, the majority rejected both of those asks that I thought were extremely legitimate. You know, the constant argument made by the majority that Republicans are interested in suppressing the vote, and that when we argue about concerns about voter integrity and fraud and things like that, they mock us. And all of that's been extremely effective. It's very sad and how effective it has been, because it's really too bad. Because the only people hurt by that are the citizens that we all represent. Everyone here in this chamber knows how real a problem we have with absentee voting. I wouldn't say that it's wide scale. I wouldn't say that the presidential election was stolen, any of that stuff. I don't know the facts in those accusations. And I would never put that out there, and I never have. But I do know of specific examples in this state that are documented that show that absentee ballot voter fraud absolutely 100% exists. And I'm going to cite a few of those examples tonight, and for one reason and one reason only, Madam President, and that is because I have been cited in several news articles of failing to ever back up anything that I say, especially when it comes to this subject. So I'm going to back up what I say. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm simply going to use things that are not in dispute. The October 4th, 2020 issue of the Waterbury Republican American newspaper did an amazing job. I think I'm the only one who received this newspaper because everyone else seems to think that this didn't happen and it doesn't exist. But they went on for 3 pages of proof in the case of instances of absentee voter fraud in the state of Connecticut. I'll just highlight a few of them for you. 2018, in the city of Stafford, Troy Stevenson was convicted of making a false statement on an absentee ballot as well as a second-degree forgery. I don't know what happened there, but he committed that crime on October 28, 2017, in conjunction with the mayoral election in Stafford. He was given a 3-year suspended sentence. Another person in the same election, Betty Chappell, was convicted of making a false statement on an absentee ballot as well as second-degree forgery. Again, in the mayoral election, she got a 5-year suspended sentence. In Hartford in 2013, I will skip that one and come back to it, actually. In 2011, Bridgeport, City Councilwoman Lydia Martinez admitted to illegally assisting in filling out absentee ballots, as well as encouraging those not eligible to vote absentee to do so. It talks about how she targeted residents of an assisted living home called Harbor View Towers. And of course, she was fined and so forth. 2009, Stafford. Lillian Cummings Stevenson agreed to a consent order after the SEC, the State Elections Enforcement Commission, found her guilty of illegally signing and submitting 2 absentee ballot request forms on behalf of her sons who were living in Europe. She was also fined. This is all from one newspaper article by one newspaper that I don't think was trying to make a super large point about this. And I'm not trying to make a super large point about this either, Madam President. I am just extremely tired of being told that I am a crazy person perpetuating a big lie. It's not a big problem. It's not a monumental problem. But to say that there's no such thing as voter fraud, and to say that we should do nothing at all about the myriad of proposals I have made as the minority leadership of the Government Administration Elections Committee solely because I want good public policy is unfair. 2005, Hartford. Prenzina Holloway voted using another voter's absentee ballot. Civil penalty, $10,000, but then was only required to pay $2,000 because of financial hardship. I don't mean to single out these folks either, but this is a matter of public record, and I am trying to document that voter fraud does happen in Connecticut, even on a small scale, but it does happen. 2003, Hartford, former state representative Barnaby Horton charged with absentee ballot fraud after he was caught inducing elderly residents to cast absentee ballots for him. After a lengthy court battle, he pleaded guilty to felony charges and agreed to pay a $10,000 fine. I'm just giving you the synopsis of these. They go on much longer with details about each of these crimes. 2001, Bridgeport, Sybil Allen, while serving as a Democrat on the Bridgeport Town Committee, engaged in a range of absentee ballot-related fraud. Allen completed ballot applications in the name of residents, forged signatures, and on at least one occasion got a voter to forge a ballot registration form for a family member who is no longer lived in the community. This goes on and on. Warren Blunt, a city councilman, pleaded guilty to being president while people cast their absentee ballots and subsequently taking those ballots while running for re-election. Paulette Park, working for a candidate for Bridgeport's 2000 Democrat Town Committee primary election, illegally persuaded voters to list false reasons for requesting absentee ballots and took possession of them and after watching voters fill them out, fined $5,000. 2001, Bridgeport. As part of the Get Out the Vote campaign leading up to the 2000 election, Ronald Cavanis admitted to distributing absentee ballots, being present while people filled them out, and then collecting them. This is called ballot harvesting, Madam President. And it is the fear and the reason why I'm standing before you at this late hour, droning on. It is because I have grave concerns about this bill passing for the wrong reasons, under the guise that we are doing something good for our constituents to protect them from COVID-19, when what's really happening is we are creating a mechanism for this type of activity by enabling the Secretary of State to do another mass mailing of absentee ballot applications to our constituents, even though those voter rolls are a documented mess. 2000, Hamden, George Cabrera Jr. entered into a settlement with the SEC. Cabrera admitted to observing a resident fill out an absentee ballot before taking possession of that ballot during the Democrat primary for town council. Just a couple of examples. As I pointed out before, we've also had 2 members of this legislative body also found guilty of absentee ballot fraud. I won't mention their names, but I have the articles right here. The people in the room know who they are. Even Senator Martin Looney, the president of this Senate, has said on the record during the 2019 debate that we had on the subject of early voting, which was not no excuse absentee voting, but rather early voting in person. He was clearly advocating for that policy over absentee balloting being expanded. He says that the House took up the issue, and that is opening the process potentially to universalization of absentee ballot. And I think these are his quotes, that is legitimately controversial because in reality, we never really know for sure who is casting an absentee ballot. That's the President of the Senate. That is the leader of the Democrat Party in this body, who I suspect supports this legislation and will vote for it. He says, if we open up absentee balloting for the convenience of those who are ill or disabled or out of state on a given day, but obviously the number of absentee ballot cases of fraud that we've had over the years well documents the flaws in that system. I don't want to go through all of his remarks. He knows what they are, and you can look them up. He clearly believed that there was risk associated with expanding absentee balloting. And so do I. I could share many more examples of problems, examples of cases where absentee ballots were sent to the wrong person. It's not just people committing wrongdoing either. People are disenfranchised all the time because of the process. One of the most common things that happens in absentee voting is that people make a mistake when completing the absentee ballot and sending it back. Can't tell you how many married couples, especially people that are good people trying to be frugal, put two absentee ballots, husband and wife, in the same envelope and send it back. You know what happens is those ballots are rejected. And they'll never know. They don't even know that their votes did not count. We need to improve this process, Madam President. I have argued year after year to improve this process, to make changes. We had pending legislation to modify our absentee ballot process to a single envelope to make it simpler so we don't have that problem. I offered that because I care that if we're going to expand absentee balloting, that we do it right, that we do it without mistakes, that we do it without fraud, that we have care. If we really care about our constituents and their right and ability to have their vote valued, then we actually have to act like it. And one of the ways that we do that is we protect their vote. We protect it in a way that says, we made sure that your vote was legitimate and we counted you, and that is what matters. And the way we protect that vote is also by making sure that other votes that are not legitimate, that are not submitted correctly, are not allowed to count. I had, Madam President, drafted 15 amendments on this bill, but I got to tell you, I'm tired. And I don't want to offer 15 amendments.
Senator Sampson.
Good evening, Mr. President. Thank you very much for the recognition. I said I was going to come back to offer at least one amendment, and I'm going to offer just one, actually, because I think this is, of all the amendments that I filed on the bill, is the most important and critical decision that we have to make going forward as a legislative body. I just want to give a little background quickly before I call the amendment, and that is that I mentioned that I think we are in a bit of a predicament because what has happened is we have a situation where we have competing policy on the subject of what sickness is defined as in our statutes and how that is interpreted when it comes to absentee voting, and then what the process is for enabling our constituents to vote. And I guess I would say that my concern about the whole thing is that the main problem that I see is the way the law that was passed during the special session was actually utilized, and not the fact that we passed it. I made it very clear from the very beginning of our debate that I was pleased to be able to accommodate my constituents and make sure that everyone has the ability to cast their vote in an election. It is the most important part of our representative system of government, that people have access to voting, and that we do make it as easy as we can. But we also must be concerned with maintaining the integrity of that process. And what has happened here is this policy, the massive expansion of the definition of illness, which you can either go by the statutory change that we made during the special session that is attempted in this bill, which simply says that COVID-19 is in existence, is satisfactory, or you can go by the Secretary of State's memorandum describing it only as people who've come in contact with or potentially believe they could have come in contact with COVID-19, or the courts, which have said that illness anywhere is a good enough reason, which would negate even the need for the legislation before us. That last option and the bill before us both create a mechanism that allows abuse to occur. And when I say abuse, I mean abuse by our elected officials in the way we cast our votes during absentee elections. And what I'm referring to is the unsolicited mailing of absentee ballot applications. I'm going to call the amendment now and discuss why I believe we need to make a change with regard to that. Mr. President, the clerk is in possession of amendment. It is LCO number 8085. I ask that I be able to call that amendment and to summarize what it says.
Mr. Clerk, would you please call the amendment that Senator Sampson has referred to?
LCO number 8085, Senate Schedule B.
Please proceed to summarize, sir. The question is on adoption.
Yeah, thank you, Madam President. I appreciate the opportunity. This is a very straightforward amendment. It simply creates a prohibition on any elected official. These are lines 16 through 19 on the amendment. It just says, notwithstanding the provisions in the rest of the section, neither the Secretary of State nor any registrar of voters, town clerk, or individual appointed thereby shall mail unsolicited applications for absentee ballots to any person. And the reason for this is that anyone that was paying attention in the November election knows that that process was a failure. As I've already pointed out, even in the much smaller primary election that occurred last July, over 100,000 ballot applications were returned, emblematic of the fact that our voter rolls are out of date and incorrect. I also, during the special session, took the time to go through a bunch of examples, which I have with me again today, and I could add to this list ad nauseum. There are so many examples that have been brought to me of people that received absentee ballot applications in error that we would be here for many hours if I went through all of them. I'm going to just list a few. And many of them were accompanied not just with a note saying, Senator Sampson, I received this and I don't know why, but also photographs. The one that I have on the top, it has a person's name crossed off with a note indicating that this person has passed. Leslie Jane contacted me. She said, yesterday in the mail I received in my home in Meriden 2 absentee ballot applications, one in English and one in Spanish. She said, I took the census, so I assumed that it would be on the record that this is an English-speaking household. Should I have gotten 2 of these ballots? She said she never voted by absentee ballot in her life and didn't understand why she was receiving one. And why is the state wasting my money in sending them? Deborah Durbin wrote me and said, my dad got an application for an absentee ballot. He died in 2011. Alexander Anderson wrote me and said, my dear friend Kiskaya and his Wolcott friends are curious why a person may receive 2 absentee ballots for the same individual, one with their maiden name and one with their married name. And she attached copies of the 2 envelopes. Rhoda Dix wrote me, the ballots came to my house mailed to a third-party address. This is opening Pandora's box, she says. Jason Webb, State Senator Rob Sampson, I received multiple absentee ballots to my address in names that I have no idea who they are. I contacted my local election office and notified them. All I got was nothing they can do about it. I'm skipping over a lot of these, but I have dozens and dozens. Mike Joswick, my father got an application for an absentee ballot. He's been deceased for 4 years. Elizabeth Ada Fiola, we got a ballot request for someone who, according to property records, hasn't lived here for 5 years. We returned it. And she goes on to explain what happened. Sherry Amoroso, my mother received one for a woman who doesn't reside at her house. Not once, but twice. Susan Albert, my grandfather has been dead for 25 years and received one. Unreal. Andrew Vignola Jr., we received ours the other day. They sent my youngest son an application, but he hasn't lived in Connecticut for 4 years. We will be voting in person. Gay Har, I received 2 ballots at my address for people who hadn't lived in Connecticut for 5 years. Anyway, you get the point. I got lots of these. This is just a small sampling of the examples. If I had made a request on social media to ask people to send them to me, I can guarantee you I would have been inundated with people. It was a very common email or phone call that I received, both around the primary election and the general election. It's unforgivable, Madam President. That's my opinion, that we would take something as important and critical to our system of laws and how we manage the government in our state and create a process that leaves so much doubt in the minds of our constituents. It's just as important that our election process is valid and accurate for the sake of it being valid and accurate as it is to inspire confidence in the people we represent. And something I've been saying this entire session is that we have to make sure, Madam President, that people have faith in our elections. And I'm afraid it's become such a partisan issue, as I alluded to earlier, that anyone that brings up the subject of election integrity they are basically mocked by the majority and the news media as if they're crackpots. That's wrong. There are people that have concerns, legitimate concerns, and I pointed out there are actual points of fact that we can look to see that these concerns are real. It is our responsibility to work together on the behalf of the people that we represent to come up with good policy to make everyone, regardless of whether they're a Republican or Democrat or unaffiliated voter, have confidence that our elections are thorough, that they are accurate, and that they can be trusted. I don't care whether that person who is concerned about the election results is a supporter of mine or not. I don't care if they are a Republican, Democrat, unaffiliated, independent, whatever. I don't care. What matters to me is that everyone, at the end of the day, trusts the election process. In national elections across the country, for the last 2 presidential cycles, one where a Republican replaced a Democrat and one where a Democrat replaced a Republican, there has been nothing but outrage by the losing party over the validity of the election. And we have heard unbelievable claims about Russian collusion and theft of elections from all sides. And I don't know what the truth of any of that is. And either do a lot of other people, and certainly the people in this room. There may be some validity to it, maybe none. But the point is, we can't have our constituents walking around wondering whether any of that's true or not. We have to do better. We have to do better to make sure that they don't doubt that. So, Madam President, the amendment that's before us is here for that one reason, which is to handle our absentee ballot process in the way that we know works. I am completely and utterly in favor of expanding our absentee ballot process to include sickness and to include COVID-19. Don't anyone doubt that. Don't anyone say otherwise. I want people to be able to vote. I want maximum access to voting. But the way our absentee ballot process works, Madam President, is you have to request one. It's not a hard process. It can be done so easily. You can go online, you can stop at the town hall, you can call the town clerk, you can get an absentee ballot, fill it out, and vote that way. It's been done that way in Connecticut for years and years. What happened in the most recent election and in the primary before it was a disaster. A complete and utter disaster that has undermined the integrity of our election process and the confidence of the people that we represent. We cannot allow it to continue, and we have to adopt this amendment to prevent that from happening again. I will make one more comment about it before voting on this amendment, and that is, I'm not opposed to this process in a vacuum. I don't even think it's a bad idea to be able to provide some sort of mail-in voting system for our constituents. As I said over and over during this debate, I believe as much as any person in any party in expanding access to elections. I have been sincere about that since the very beginning of my service in the legislature and my service on the committee that does elections. What I'm concerned about is that we don't do that until we do it correctly. And we have the ability to do it and keep the confidence of our constituents. We don't have that today. And therefore, we should not be engaging in this process anymore until we actually own up to the fact that we can't have no excuse absentee voting unless we have some process that trusts the integrity of it. Even if it was created in error by the courts or by this bill, it doesn't matter. What needs to happen is we need to have elections that we can trust and that our constituents can trust also. I urge adoption of this amendment, Madam President. It's the right thing for us to do. It's the right compromise. We can accommodate people's concerns about COVID-19, but we can let them trust the process by using the absentee ballot system the way it has always been done. I urge adoption, Madam President, and I'd like a roll call vote. Thank you.
Thank you. And when the vote is taken, it will be taken by roll. Will you remark further on the amendment that is before us? Senator Flexer.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, while I appreciate some of the sentiments of the good ranking member of the GAE committee and the conversation tonight and on the conversation on many issues, I do rise in opposition to the amendment, and I do want to encourage my colleagues to vote no and to just make clear that both the underlying bill that is before us and the legislation that we voted on and passed last year had no mention about the mailing of absentee ballot applications. That's not covered in the bill that's before us. I understand the argument that the senator just made in support of his amendment, but the bill before us does not encourage or require anyone to mail applications for absentee ballots, just like last year's legislation did not. And in conversations with the Secretary of the State's office, it's my understanding that they have no such plans to mail absentee ballot applications as they did last year. So for those reasons, I encourage my colleagues to reject this amendment. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I rise in support of the amendment before us. This is an amendment that would require photo identification for eligibility to vote in in-person elections in Connecticut. It also includes a waiver of the fee to obtain a photo ID from the Department of Motor Vehicles for those that are facing challenges financially and cannot afford one. Madam President, this amendment is a complete no-brainer. That's the way I would describe it. Photo identification polls in the 80% and above across the country. Everybody understands the importance of making sure that if we're going to maintain the integrity of our elections, that we actually know who is voting. I also understand that some people watching this might think we already have photo ID in Connecticut. I know that when I go to vote in the town of Wolcott, they more or less expect me to have a driver's license because virtually everybody in town has one. But what people might not realize is that we do not have a photo identification requirement in Connecticut. I find it amazing also. And that's why this amendment is before us, and it's something that should change. The current law requires some sort of identification, but no photo identification, something that exists in almost every other state. Madam President, the narrative on elections in our state has been that the majority party wants to keep expanding access to elections while Republicans are in opposition to that. And I have to tell you, as a member of the minority, that is the most frustrating thing for me to hear day in and day out. And I'm sad to say that it's actually repeated in the press as if it's true also. It's not true. I have, as a member of the committee that has cognizance over elections, I've supported numerous expansions in elections, including early voting and no excuse absentee voting. But I've always added the caveat that when we do these things, we have to do them responsibly. We have to include protections to make sure that the election is valid. Because if you truly care that the election is open and fair to everyone and that every person's vote counts, then you have to make sure the election's legitimate. Because if the election's not legitimate, then no one's vote counts, and people begin to doubt the process. And we see it happening in our country. Senator Kelly made an amazingly good point at the beginning of his remarks, which is that there should be far fewer partisan votes in this chamber. He's right about that. But I would go one step further to say that there should never be a partisan vote on the subject of election policy. That is something that we should put partisan politics aside from on every time that it comes up. Because this is about the process. This is about the process that we all have to agree to trust about how our elections work. It's the reason why our redistricting process is done in a nonpartisan way with equal membership. And these bills that have to do with how we're radically changing our election process need to be done in a way where everyone's in agreement, that we can live with the terms of those changes. I know it's simple when you're in the majority to just assume that whatever you want to do is the right decision. I wouldn't know. I haven't served in the majority in the legislature. I hope I get the chance someday. But I ask my colleagues that are in the majority to just contemplate once in a while what it might be like to serve in the minority and to represent people. I represent the same number of people as every other person in this chamber. And as far as I'm concerned, I should have as much voice as every other person in this chamber. I believe I do. Now, I don't prevail on many votes. But I want to be treated, and I want my constituents, more importantly, to be treated as if their voice does count when it comes through me in this chamber. And sometimes I'm afraid, Madam President, I don't feel like that's happening. And that should never be the case on something that is critical and as important as election policy. The minority voice counts. We want security in elections along with the expansion. I'll just take a side moment here. I don't mean to get off the bill, but on a related subject, we're going to vote on massive expansions of voting in this state over the next several weeks. When we do, you're going to see Republicans desiring to support those policies, wanting to be part of them. Let us be part of them by including our ideas for signature verification and things like photo ID. And we can make the first step right now, Madam President. We can vote photo ID into our Connecticut law. We can join almost every other state in the country that already has it. It's simple. Let's do it. It's the responsible thing to do. Every argument against photo ID is a phony argument. I have heard over the years in this chamber, in the House, in committee, on social media, in the news, pundits talk about how this is a racist policy. That's a bunch of nonsense. That is complete and utter nonsense. In fact, it's insulting, I think, to anyone to suggest that somehow because of their background or where they come from or their race that they can't obtain a photo ID. Everyone can obtain a photo ID. You need a photo ID to do a million things in our society. You can't rent a hotel room. You can't buy a pack of cigarettes. You can't get on an airplane. I used to carry around a list of those things with me. I wish I had it right this minute. You'd be surprised at everything you need a photo ID for. And we don't require that for something as sacred as voting to make sure that our election actually is accurate, that the results matter. It's ridiculous, and I'm tired of hearing the argument. Madam President, please, let's have this vote. Let's see us do the right thing. Let's actually pass something that would make a difference to give people in Connecticut some confidence that our elections are accurate. Thank you.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I rise in support of the amendment before us. This particular amendment, as was just mentioned by the minority leader, establishes something very, very simple and I think easy to accomplish, which is nothing more than a pilot program to begin the process of learning how to do signature verification in our state, and it's a incredibly small ask, in my opinion. It is simply would establish 5 municipalities of different sizes to test the process so we could be better equipped if the state at some point decides to begin expanding absentee voting in a big way. The bill before us, as we've discussed, essentially creates no excuse absentee voting in our state without a constitutional amendment. I don't even think that's much in doubt after the debate that we've had. If that's going to happen, then I believe, Madam President, that we need to be ready for the consequences. And the consequence is that there are going to be many, many more votes cast by absentee, as there were in the recent November election. The language that's before us is not new. This is the same exact language that I offered as an amendment in the Government Administration and Elections Committee earlier this year as an amendment on our constitutional proposal that is out there to adopt no excuse absentee voting. What's funny about it is, and just I'm having difficulty trying to maintain my composure because of some of the comments Senator Duff made regarding election security. I have great respect for every member of this chamber, and I did nothing to disrespect anyone or to try and paint any political party or person as if they somehow care less about the integrity of elections than other. But the facts are quite clear. I have proposed over the years in this legislature probably dozens of bills that would improve the integrity of elections, and I've been lucky to even have a hearing on them, let alone a vote in committee. And throughout the process this particular year on the discussion on our constitutional amendments, I brought up the subject of signature verification, reminding my colleagues in both parties that it's almost unheard of to have expansions of absentee voting, no excuse absentee voting, or mail-in voting. The states that have that across the country all have some sort of process to verify what's happening. They have signature verification. It shocks me to my core, Madam President, that this body is going to pass this bill today, creating no excuse absentee voting, and that there's a constitutional amendment pending, and there's been no conversation, no discussion, and no effort to even look at signature verification. I was told during the debate in the committee when I offered this amendment, we agree with you, Senator Sampson. These are good ideas. We just don't want to muddy the water of the constitutional amendment. It should be proposed as a separate bill. I tried that, and guess what? It failed, Madam President, on a party line. So I'm here today, again, Madam President, with what I believe really is almost a feeble and desperate attempt by the minority to ask for some attention to our concerns. We really should be doing real-life signature verification if we're going to do massive expansion of absentee voting in our state. We should. But we're not even asking for that here. We're asking for the majority to please understand that we have to do something about this process to maintain its integrity. This is hardly a big deal. This is a Senate bill that is before us. If this amendment is adopted by this chamber, it will simply become part of the bill that could be passed in the House. And we'll be on our way to doing something in a bipartisan fashion. It doesn't have to go back to a different chamber. It's not a constitutional amendment. It's an easy thing to do. You can take up this piece of legislation as an amendment, as a token gesture that you're hearing us, that you believe that what we're saying about maintaining election integrity matters. I encourage adoption of the amendment. Thank you, Madam President.